Welcome to the wonderful world of Lego Island. Super nostalgic, super iconic, and no, it hasn't aged very well. You may have been looking at these beautiful, high-resolution textures and detailed polygons thinking, "Whoa! Is that RTX 2080? 8K 128-bit HDR? 88 miles per hour?" No, it is not. But those who grew up with it know how much fun this game was back in the day, and what it lacks in modern technical prowess, it makes up for in endless charm and enjoyability. Unfortunately, this game is officially old enough to drink now, and this old-timer has more than a couple old-timey issues. One of the most infamous of these is the turn speed, which was left tied to the frame rate. A frame rate of maybe 10 or 15 on computers at the time. Yes, computers used to struggle rendering this, but our modern computers have no such limitations, at least with this game, leading to a turn speed that'll make you want to jump off the information center. Try to play this game now without crashing into walls or the side of the road. Literally anyone who's tried to speedrun this game knows exactly the frustration I'm talking about. Apparently they found and even patched this super late in development, but the fix never made it into retail copies or even as a downloadable. So I kinda made my own? No, I'm trying to flex. This was actually much simpler than it might sound. I didn't go as far as decoupling the turning from the frame rate, but I did manage to override the multipliers used for calculating the turn speed, so you can finally slow yourself down. If you're a masochist, you can also speed yourself up! This is all in my tool, Lego Island Rebuilder, which you can check out using the link below. But that's not the point of this video. Today we're talking about music. One of the most treasured parts of the game if you ask any lifelong fan of it, but yet another thing that hasn't aged very well is the music quality. Doesn't it sound a little muffled? To be honest, it's hard to tell if you're used to it the way it is, but recently one of the game's composers released some new high-quality transfers from tape. Have a listen to this. Doesn't that just feel like you cleaned the wax out of your ears and surfaced from 30 feet under the sea? It turns out, to save storage space, Lego Island compresses the shit out of its music. When we talk about compression these days, we usually mean relatively unnoticeable compression schemes like MP3, AAC, or Vorbis to name a few, but back then these codecs either didn't exist or would have taken way too much CPU to use in-game. So for Lego Island, compression means dropping the quality low. Most of the music is only stored at 11.025 kHz, which, if you don't know, carries only a quarter of the total amount of frequencies that human ears can hear, 44.1 kHz being considered enough for all of them, which is why most digital audio you hear will either be 44 or sometimes 48 kHz. This means the top 3/4 of sound has been chopped out of the game music. This is what it would sound like if I did the same thing to my voice right now. Fun fact, this is actually what Meghan Trainor meant by all about that bass. She's talking about Lego Island. It's also all mono, meaning just 1 out of 2 ears worth of information. It's fine, but as soon as you hear stereo, especially when wearing headphones, it's like... And finally, we have these high-quality releases thanks to composer Lauren Nelson, who worked on much of the game's soundtrack. Not the highest quality studio master tapes, mind you, just the highest quality tapes currently known to exist. The original master tapes are, they're unavailable right now.
Who lives in a pineapple under the sea? The Lego Island soundtrack master tapes.
So the question that comes up, now that we have this high-quality music, can we get it back into the game somehow? The answer was uncertain. All of Lego Island's assets are stored in proprietary, undocumented formats. They aren't just files that can be replaced. A few brave souls had managed to crack extracting music and some other assets from the game, but no one had quite figured out reinserting it. And after the journey I've been on, I can kind of understand why. Luckily, I had some starting points thanks to extractors like Lime, the Lego Island music extractor. It's a Python script and does exactly what it says. Hey, presumably if you know how to extract music, you more or less know how to reinsert it, right? Well, here starts the adventure in figuring that out. The first thing you need to know is that all the audio is uncompressed PCM. It's low quality, as established before, but otherwise uncompressed. This makes it very malleable as we can more or less read and write to the audio data directly, rather than having to deal with the obscure mathematical algorithms of a compression codec. As such, we can do nifty things like import the audio directly into Audacity. As long as we specify the right parameters, which for Lego Island's music is this, we'll get Lego Island music. Sort of. There seems to be a little extra... percussion in these songs. Okay, that's not music! Well, actually, funnily enough, it is music. It's just, for some reason, in a completely different format. While most of the music is 11 kHz 16-bit, a handful of tracks are 22 kHz 8-bit. I'm not exactly sure why. It ends up using precisely the same space anyway, since it essentially doubles one, halves the other. The 8-bit sample format needs to be read differently, but as you can see, it is indeed music. What's weird is some of these tracks are just the 11 kHz tracks duplicated in 22 kHz, but in those situations it's still the 11 kHz ones that end up getting used in-game. But damn, you can really hear the difference in the sample rate. Listen to the jail theme in both formats. I actually kind of prefer the 22 kHz tracks, but I guess the dither noise was considered less pleasant or something. At this point, you might be thinking, so does that mean they compressed the shit out of the music to save space while also having a bunch of unused tracks just sitting around? The answer is... yeah. Anyways, enough background. How do we actually replace the music? You may be familiar with the concept of game scripts if you've ever worked on or ROM hacked a game before, and LEGO Islands are in the form of these proprietary SI files, and the music is appropriately stored in jukebox.si. As I mentioned earlier, extracting music from jukebox.si has been done for quite some time, but reinserting is a whole other story. But if the music is just uncompressed PCM, can't you just swap it out with new PCM data and call it a day? You would think so, but not quite, and it's all because of those clicks that we were hearing before. What are they? Well, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to call in an old friend for this one. This is the hex editor, something all ROM hackers are eventually forced to become familiar with. Now I'm not going to go into excruciating detail here. I mostly want to stick to the basics, but if you're interested in the specifics, check the description for a write-up of how this file works. As such, just trust me when I say the first song in the file starts here, right after MXCH followed by 18 bytes. Now as I scroll down through a lot more bytes, you'll eventually see another MXCH and 18 bytes right in the middle of the music data. In fact, you'll see one for at least every second of music data, and sometimes you'll even see two. So what the hell are these doing here? Well, here's yet another thing that the LEGO Island developers did in order to help computers of the era play their game properly. The SI files are all split up into chunks, which is where the CH in MXCH comes from. The 22 bytes, MXCH plus 18 bytes, is a chunk header, and every click we heard in Audacity is it trying to read those chunk headers erroneously as audio data. Why would they want to split the audio into 1-second chunks? Well, here it doesn't really make much sense since it's mostly just music files, but in the other SI files, they do something fairly clever. CD drives weren't all that fast back then, and since most of the data would be streaming off the CD to save user hard drive space, it made sense to play to the CD drive's strength, which is reading data in one continuous stream. Anytime the CD drive has to jump somewhere else on the disk to read something potentially wastes a lot of time. For example, if the Infomaniac is talking, we have to read his animation data, his voice data, and the background music, if not more, all at the same time, and your mid-90s CD drive may not even be fast enough to keep up with it all. So instead, the LEGO Island developers chose to interleave multiple types of data together throughout all these SI files. 1 second of animation data, followed by 1 second of voice data, back and forth, so the data can be read in one continuous stream. You can hear it here in some of the Infomaniac's dialogue.
Hello! Hola! Welcome!
Or the noisy ear ape is animation and graphics data that's being interleaved with the dialogue to cut down on CD seeking. This is probably yet another reason for the generally low music quality. An original 1x speed CD drive literally maxes out at the bitrate for full quality Redbook audio. So in many ways, they may have just wanted to free up bandwidth so they could stream actual game data with their audio. It kind of makes you appreciate how much work went into these old games just to keep them afloat on these old systems. So the whole game uses chunks to store its assets, which means we're going to have to play along if we want to replace any of them. Now it was time to do some coding. I quickly mocked up a C# script that could replace the PCM data in jukebox.si with new data, without touching any of the chunk headers or any other data in it, because naturally it worked pretty well since it was just swapping the audio data straight. But to be honest, this isn't really what we're here for. By leaving the headers alone, we're stuck at the same crappy quality and precisely the same length as the song we just replaced. So to do better than that, we'll need to get into the real nitty-gritty. First, I just needed to know whether it was even possible to play higher quality music. Did LEGO Island have some kind of hard-coded cap for the sample rate? I knew it at least supported both 11 kHz and 22 kHz, since both types of audio are in the file, but I had no idea whether there was a way to coerce it into 44 kHz. While trying to make sense of all the non-audio header data, I noticed something very interesting. Firstly, each song in the SI file does indeed specify its sample rate, which is good news as I was worried it might just be a single flag toggle between 11 and 22 or something. But not only that, the data here is actually identical to the header of a WAV file, which is extremely well documented and fairly simple to grasp. That means I can use the hex editor to literally just transplant the header data from the WAV file into the SI file. And since the header data specifies the sample rate and other specs for the audio, this should get Lego Island playing higher quality music. And you know what? It totally does.
Sign in, please.
But there's still a problem. If you know audio, you may already know what it is. We've just upgraded from 11 kHz mono audio data to 44 kHz stereo audio data. That's 4 times the sample rate and double the channels, meaning 8 times the data size. And since we didn't mess around with any chunks, we're stuck with the same amount of bytes as the last song, and suddenly that same amount of space means only an eighth of the audio time compared to before. For the Information Center theme, that means a 2.5-minute song becomes only 18 seconds. It's not even enough to get into the first verse of Africa. So, we're gonna need a bigger chunk. Or more of them. At this point, I wasn't entirely sure. My first idea was to try inserting one giant chunk at the end with the rest of the song. I figured since it's 2019 and I'm running the game off an SSD, it might just work. But nope, the game just crashes after those 18 seconds, rather than looping. Well, that's good. Next, I modified my C# script to insert the rest of the song one chunk at a time. I noticed almost all the chunks were exactly 22,050 bytes, or roughly 22 kilobytes in size, which makes sense for 1 second of data, 11,025 Hz and 16 bits. Even though a second of data is now significantly more than that in bytes, it still seemed to be working for those 18 high-quality seconds we had so far, so I just decided to insert the rest of the song in 22 kilobyte chunks. Unfortunately, it didn't help. In fact, it started skipping. What the hell could that mean? I was stuck here for a very long time. I was obviously missing something, but what? I scoured through all the header data looking for anything I might have missed, any differences between my modded file and the original, anything that might specify a length or a number of chunks, but I couldn't find anything. No one had written anything about this online, and none of the extractors had any information because all they needed to do was strip out the headers, not figure out how they worked. No matter what I did, the music would either start glitching out or just completely crash the game. I was stuck for so long, I actually gave up at this point for weeks, just completely dumbfounded at how little sense I could make of it. But eventually, I came crawling back. It was then that I made yet another very interesting realization. As I said before, almost all of the chunks are 22 kilobytes in size, but what about the chunks that aren't? I noticed them before, but couldn't deduce any sort of reliable pattern from them. All I knew was that every 5 or so chunks, it seemed, sometimes it was 7, sometimes it was 10, there were 2 significantly smaller chunks, before returning to the normal sized chunks again. The 2 smaller chunks would always add up to 22,050, almost like the chunks were being split in half every so often. But for what reason? There was never a consistent number of chunks between each split that I could tell, or even a certain amount of audio data. I seriously couldn't figure it out. But then, while just staring at the hex data in desperation, I finally saw what was happening. Every split occurred precisely at a multiple of 20,000 hex. 20,000. 40,000, 60,000, 80,000. For the entire file, everything was split at 20,000 hex. I realized every single split that occurred, the first chunk would end right before a multiple of 20,000 hex, and the second would start right after. So here's what I think is happening. When Lego Island is reading from disk, it doesn't read one chunk at a time or anything like that. It has to buffer the data in, allocating 20,000 hex or roughly 131 kilobytes in memory to stream data from the SI files. And it will only read that much data from an SI file at any given time, at an offset that's an exact multiple of 20,000 hex. If a chunk exceeds that boundary, the chunk has to be split, but the game engine will automatically connect it to the other half of the chunk in the next sequential read. This explains why making one giant chunk would crash the game, and also why just adding chunks at the end would also eventually cause problems. Without proper care and attention, these chunks would eventually exceed a 20,000 hex boundary, which would cause the game to try to read beyond the memory allocated for the SI data, which usually leads to a crash. This was the big breakthrough that allowed me to insert music at not only any quality, but also any length. But of course, it wasn't quite that simple, since if every song needs to be split at 20,000 hex, and I'm inserting a new, much larger song, then suddenly all the songs after have been shifted forward and need to be readjusted around these 20,000 hex boundaries so that they still play correctly. In essence, inserting a song will inherently mess up every single song after it, which is, cool. I eventually reworked my scripts to reconstruct jukebox.si from scratch, extracting all the songs so that when it reinserts them, it can chunk them all around these boundaries and keep everything to Lego Island's surprisingly strict standards. But my god, was that a sweet, sweet victory to hear the first verse all the way to the end of Africa. From here, any song could be inserted, including the most exciting, the high-quality releases of Lego Island. This is kind of incredible, and it's crazy to hear the music you're so familiar with, but suddenly in such high quality. This is exactly what I was hoping for when I started working on this project. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. Listen to this weird audio glitch when the music changes. Do you hear that really weird skipping that plays during the fade transition? Here we go again. With no real knowledge on Lego Island, there wasn't much I could determine from this. I have no idea how its music transition functions work, but the only thing that changed is the jukebox.si, so it was back to staring at that in the hex editor. At this point, I was still using the 22,050 byte chunks, obviously splitting when necessary since those had been working properly so far. But now I was wondering if Lego Island really expected each chunk to be 1 second long. Well, for a 44.1 kHz stereo 16-bit track, the chunk size would be significantly larger. 176,400 bytes for 1 second, as opposed to 22,050. For those keeping track at home, that is actually larger than the 20,000 hex limit, meaning chunks would have to be split pretty much every time. And depending on where the chunk fell, it might even have to be split twice. I honestly had no idea if this would work, or even if it would solve anything, but I went back to my script to try it. It actually, amazingly, works perfectly and fixed the transition skipping in the process. My only assumption is Lego Island does expect the chunks to be 1 second long, and therefore fades the music based on the chunk size rather than time. Either way, at this point I was just glad to have gotten this far. But there was one last issue, one last middle finger that Lego Island had to give me. The radio didn't work.
In your home or in your car.
Or rather, it did, but there were issues. Parts of the radio would play over each other, and sometimes there would be long pauses of silence. Just general strange behavior. Despite how annoying this was to discover, this is actually one of my favorite fun facts that I learned about Lego Island in this process. While I was trying to get Africa to play more than 18 seconds looking for some kind of length or number of chunks value, I noticed what suspiciously looked like a millisecond value, but much larger. See, in milliseconds this is the exact length of the information center theme, but somehow with a bunch of zeros after it. Changing it seemed to have zero effect, so I just kinda left it. But now it occurred to me that maybe it did have a purpose after all. My hunch turned out to be correct, except the milliseconds weren't quite used for what I thought, at least not exactly. The millisecond value happened to be always followed by this, 10,000 here, but always some sort of multiple of 10. I could see that dividing the first number by the second would result in the actual millisecond length of the song, but for what purpose? With the radio acting up, I decided to check the millisecond values there. Here, the value wasn't 10,000 or even close, it was just 1. And this is when it hit me. What if the second number is the number of loops, and the first is the millisecond length of all those loops? I actually tested this by setting the second value to 2 and setting the first to the number of milliseconds multiplied by 2, and this is what I got.
L-E-G-O radio. In your home or in your car.
So, Lego Island music does not loop infinitely, as it might intuitively seem. Instead, they just make it loop for an obscenely long time, 10,000 times in the case of the Information Center music, I never noticed any difference changing these values before, since either way, I was never getting past 18 seconds. In theory, the information center music at 2.5 minutes and 10,000 loops will stop looping after playing for around 17 days straight. Ain't nobody got time for that, but just for fun, I found the shortest song in the game, which is the Dune Buggy Building song, clocking in at just 32 seconds, which also, funnily enough, happens to only loop 1,000 times, meaning it'll stop looping after just a little under 9 hours. And here's me leaving my computer on overnight with the stock jukebox.si just to capture the glorious moment at 8 hours and 53 minutes when the music straight up stops playing. As does the video in the background, which is interleaved with it. I made one more modification to my script to add correct millisecond and loop values, meaning the radio works beautifully. And thus brings a close to the saga of inserting music into LEGO Island. Now, if you don't want to mess around with any of that hex editing and junk, I mentioned before my modding tool, LEGO Island Rebuilder. It actually has all that extraction and insertion functionality built in with a nice little UI to make it easy and accessible. So if you are interested in reinserting music into LEGO Island, go check that out in the description down below. Hopefully this wasn't too dull and you guys found it as interesting as I did. Like I said, if you want to see technical information, check the description down below and let me know in the comments if you liked this, didn't like this, want me to ROM hack something else, either in or outside of LEGO Island, anything at all, and I'll check it out. And as always, I'll see you next time. Thanks guys.